The first snow of November had not yet decided whether it wanted to stay. It dusted the platform of Coldwater Creek's small train station like powdered ash melting, where it touched the wooden boards clinging where it found cold iron. The mountains to the west stood in their permanent judgment above the town, gray and enormous, indifferent to everything that happened in their shadow. The train had been running 2 hours late out of Denver. By the time it groaned to a stop at Coldwater Creek, most of the passengers had already gathered their bags and their impatience. They pushed toward the doors in the usual way of people who had been sitting too long and wanted the world to know it. She was the last one off. She came down the iron steps carefully, one hand on the railing, the other occupied. Not with a bag, not with a bundle, with a saddle. A full cavalry saddle, brown leather gone dark with age, and used the kind of weight that belonged across a horse's back, not a woman's shoulder. She carried it the way a man carries a rifle he has owned for 20 years without thinking about it, without performing the effort of it. It was simply part of her body the way her arm was part of her body. The station agent looked up from his logbook. The two men drinking outside the saloon across the street stopped their conversation. A woman sweeping the steps of the dry goods store paused mid-stroke, broom held still in the cold air. She did not look at any of them. She looked west, toward the mountains. And what she did with her eyes in those first few seconds was not the looking of a woman who had never seen mountains before. It was something more specific than that. She was reading the ridgeline, measuring the gaps between peaks, estimating distance, noting where the tree line ended and the rock began. She was doing what a person does when they have been taught that landscape is information, not scenery. Her name was Marin Quinn Weller. She was 22 years old. She had come from Philadelphia by way of 2 train changes and a broken promise she had made to herself about never running from anything again. She had broken the promise the moment a man named Henderson had knocked on her apartment door with a document in his hand and a smile on his face that had nothing kind in it. But that was Philadelphia. That was another world. This was Coldwater Creek, Colorado, November of 1887, and the mountains were waiting. She crossed the platform and went into the station house to get out of the wind. The agent watched her come through the door with the saddle still on her shoulder, and to his credit, he only stared for a moment before remembering that his job involved paper and not opinions. She set the saddle down on the bench along the wall, not dropped, set, with deliberate care tilting it so the skirts rested flat, adjusting the stirrups so they would not scratch the wood. Her hands knew the object, the way hands know something they have touched 10,000 times. Once it was settled, she did not look at it. She looked at her own left hand instead, at the simple band of iron on her ring finger, plain and unadorned, the kind of ring a man buys when he loves a woman more than he has money for. Edward Weller had been a good man. He had been a clerk in a shipping office, and he had known how to make her laugh, and he had loved her without condition and without drama, which she had not understood the rarity of until he was gone. He had coughed his last breath into a cloth in January, and by March the men from the lending house had come with their documents and their measuring eyes, and by May she had nothing left that had once been theirs, nothing, that is, except the saddle. She looked away from the ring. The station agent cleared his throat. She turned to him. "Someone coming to meet you, ma'am." "I'm told so," she said. "Harlow's Peak Ranch, someone from the Harlow family." The agent's expression shifted in a way she had learned to read. It was the expression people in small towns produce when they know something and are deciding how much of it to share. He settled on a small nod. "You'll know them when you see them," he said. "Big family, hard to miss." She thanked him and returned to the bench. She took a folded paper from the inside pocket of her coat and read it again, not because she needed to, but because it steadied her. The contract was written in a clear, deliberate hand. Ward Harlow's Peak Ranch, Coldwater Creek, Colorado. Terms of service. Terms of arrangement. The formal language of a transaction that was also underneath its formal language an act of desperation on the part of a man who needed someone and did not have another way to say so. She had answered the advertisement because she had no other advertisement to answer. The arrangement was what people in polite company called a mail order arrangement, and what people in honest company called what it was. A working agreement, first and foremost, a practical solution to a practical problem. She was not a girl with fantasies about ranchers. She was a woman with debts and a skill, and a saddle she would not sell, and she needed a place to stand. She folded the paper back into her pocket. The brakeman who had worked the rear car came in to warm his hands and noticed her in the way that men on train platforms notice women traveling alone with an assessment that was not quite rude, but was not quite not rude either. She met his eyes briefly and then looked past him at the door, and something in the steadiness of her gaze apparently settled the question he had been forming, because he went to stand on the other side of the stove without speaking. She had learned that in the months since Edward died. The look, her father had called it the line. As in the line you do not cross the place where a thing stops being a request and becomes a position. Sergeant Thomas Quinn had believed in lines. He had believed in them the way some men believe in scripture, as permanent geography, not rules but facts of the land. Her hand moved before she was aware it was moving. It touched the saddle. Specifically, it touched a point on the right fender just below the cantle, where a piece of brown leather cord was tied over something she had covered deliberately. Covered, but not removed. There was a difference between those two things, and she had thought about that difference for 11 years. She pulled her hand back, looked at the door instead. Outside, the snow was beginning to make up its mind. The wagon came 20 minutes later, driven by a man with red hair and a jaw that looked like it had been hewn from the same material as the mountains behind him. He was perhaps 30 broad through the shoulders, in the way of someone who has worked with iron and heavy things from a young age. He had a precise way of sitting on the wagon seat slightly forward, his weight distributed for balance and one leg stretched a little longer than the other. A compensating habit so natural he was probably not aware of doing it. She noticed the leg before she noticed anything else about him. Then she noticed that he was looking at her with the kind of open assessment that was not hostility, but was also not politeness. He was looking at her the way she had looked at the mountains. He climbed down from the wagon and came to the station house door. He was taller than she had estimated. "Marin Weller," he said. "Yes," she said. "Beckett Harlow," he said. "Not Mr. Just the name offered like something placed on a table." "I'm the second one. Ward sent me to fetch you." He paused. "Ward's the eldest. He runs the ranch." "I know," she said. "I read the contract." Something in the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, something that might become one under the right conditions. "You got bags?" he asked. "One never." "One," she said, and then she picked up the saddle with both hands and walked toward the door, and she felt him go still behind her, the way a person goes still when they see something unexpected. He caught up to her at the wagon. He reached for the saddle with the reflex of a man raised to carry heavy things for women, and she stepped to the side of the reach without making a production of it, lifting the saddle onto the wagon bed herself with the practiced motion of someone who has done it many times. He stood with his hands briefly empty. Then he picked up her canvas bag and set it in beside the saddle, and they both understood something had been negotiated without a word being spoken. She climbed up to the wagon seat. He came around and took the reins, and they pulled away from the station and out onto the main road through Coldwater Creek. She was aware of the eyes following them. She did not turn to acknowledge any of them. The road out of town began to climb almost immediately. The mountains, which had seemed enormous from the platform, became more specific as they drove toward them, their lower slopes visible now through the ponderosa pine, the rock faces appearing between the trees in pale winter gray. The air sharpened. She breathed it carefully at first, testing it the way you test water before you step into it. Beckett drove without commentary for a while. She had expected him to make conversation in the way men make conversation with women. They are responsible for transporting, filling space with information. He did not. He drove, and she looked at the landscape, and after a few minutes of this, she realized she was comfortable with the silence in a way she had not expected. "How long is the drive?" she asked, not because she was anxious, but because she wanted to know. "Hour and a half in good weather," he said. "A bit more today." She nodded. She studied the road as they climbed, noting where it crossed a dry creek bed, where it ran along the base of a granite shelf, where it opened into a small meadow that would flood in spring. The habits her father had laid down in her were not habits she had chosen. They were simply the way she perceived the world. Landscape is information. Always. The road dropped down into a shallow draw, and Beckett's weight shifted on the seat, and his left leg moved slightly outward for balance. She had been right about the leg. The compensation was automatic years deep. He caught her looking, not at him precisely, but at the subtle thing his body had done. "Broke it when I was 8, he said without inflection. "Set a little crooked." "I know," she said. "Then because that required explanation, your horse compensates. I noticed when you drove up, the left rear tends slightly inward at the walk. He's adjusted to carrying you unevenly." There was a pause. The wagon wheels crossed a patch of frozen mud with a sound like breaking crockery. Beckett said. That was all, but she felt the quality of his attention change beside her the way you feel a room change when someone in it stops performing and starts being present. The draw opened and the road curved, and at the top of a long rise she saw a figure at a gate in a timber fence. Younger than Beckett, taller and leaner with brown gold hair under a battered hat and a notebook open in his hands, a pencil moving. He looked up as the wagon approached, and his eyes went directly to her. Not with the ranging assessment of someone sizing up a stranger, but with the focused concentration of someone who is already taking notes. "That's Callum," Beckett said. "Youngest." The youngest Harlow brother stopped the wagon with a hand gesture and came around to the side. He looked at Marin directly in the way of someone who has decided that courtesy and honesty can coexist. "You know horses," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her hands, then at the saddle in the wagon bed, then back at her face. His pencil moved once. "Good," he said and opened the gate. Beckett drove through. Callum walked beside the wagon for a moment, and she was aware of his pencil moving again, quick strokes in the notebook. She did not ask. If he wanted to tell her, he would tell her. The road ran another quarter-mile through timber before the trees thinned and the ranch came into view. She had formed an idea of it from the contract and from what she knew of mountain ranches, generally a collection of buildings arranged practically built for function before beauty. What she saw was larger than her idea. 3 long barn structures arranged in an L around a working yard, a smithy with its own chimney, storage buildings, a bunkhouse, a root cellar cut into the hillside. In the main house, 2 stories of dark timber and stone foundation with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides of it. The yard was active. Men moved between the structures with the efficiency of people who do not stop moving because there are always more things to do. The sounds were the sounds of a place that worked. Iron on iron from the smithy, the low percussion of horses shifting in the barns, a gate swinging. Somewhere someone splitting wood with the rhythmic patience of someone who has split a great deal of wood in their life and has made peace with it. She smelled it before anything else. It hit her before the images resolved into meaning, before she could sort out what she was seeing. It came up through the cold air and into the back of her throat, and it was so specific and so complete that for a moment she was 11 years old again, standing in a different yard in a different state, watching her father come out of the barn with hay on his boots and his hat pushed back, and that expression he wore when he had solved a problem with a horse that had not had a solution yesterday. Hay, horses, leather and iron, and the cold, specific smell of a horse's breath in winter air. She made her face still. She was good at this. Edward had always said she could face a hurricane with a poker face, and he had not meant it entirely as a compliment. She breathed through the memory and let it settle into the place where she kept things that had to be kept. Beckett brought the wagon to a stop in the center of the yard and climbed down. She climbed down on her own side. She reached into the wagon bed and lifted the saddle back to her shoulder. Silas Drummond appeared from between 2 of the barn structures like something that had been waiting. He was perhaps 46 with a foreman's bearing, the kind of man who has exercised authority over other men for long enough that it has become part of his posture. He had a tobacco-stained beard and eyes that processed information quickly and in one direction only, toward what was useful to Silas Drummond. He looked at Marin the way an accountant looks at a line item he suspects is wrong. "This ain't a charity operation," he said. It was not said to anyone in particular. It was said to the air in the general direction of where she was standing, which she understood was its own kind of deliberate. Whatever arrangement's been made, there's work to be done here, and we don't carry dead weight. She looked at him. She let the silence sit for 2 full seconds, which is longer than it sounds. "I'm not dead weight," she said. I carry my own. She shifted the saddle on her shoulder as she said it, which was not performed. It was simply true. Drummond looked at the saddle with an expression she could not fully read, something between contempt and calculation, and then looked at her face, and the calculation part sharpened in a way that she filed away for later. She walked past him. The main house steps were directly ahead of her. She was 3 strides into the yard when she was aware of someone standing on the porch. She had not seen him arrive there. He was simply present, the way a thing can be present in a landscape that you were looking at a moment ago and was not there and now is. He stood at the top of the porch steps with his arms at his sides and nothing in his hands. He was tall, not in the way of a man who is aware of his height, in the way of a man who has simply always been tall and has organized the rest of himself around it. He was perhaps 36 with dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that belonged on someone who made decisions that could not be unmade. He wore a plain work shirt and leather braces, and his hands were at his sides, with the stillness of hands that are used to holding weapons and are currently choosing not to. Ward Harlow. She knew it before anyone said his name. She knew it the way you know certain things by weight. He looked at her with eyes the color of winter sky, pale gray, and without warmth but also without cruelty, the eyes of a man who looks at things as they are, rather than as he would prefer them to be. He did not come down the steps. He waited, not impatiently, the way a man waits who has learned that what reveals itself in waiting is worth waiting for. She stopped walking. She held his eyes. "I was told you need someone who knows horses," she said. "What I need," he said, "is someone who can prove it." From somewhere to her right, a sound rose in the cold air. Not the general sound of the ranch's activity, but something specific and sharp. A wall of panic compressed into noise. From the last barn, a horse was screaming. Not the sound of an animal in pain. The sound of an animal in terror. High and continuous and percussive, punctuated by the percussion of hooves against wood that went through the ribs before it registered in the ears. She turned toward the sound. "Ironclad," Ward said, and his voice was level, but she heard the tightness in it, the very slight compression of someone containing something. "Second week, 2 men in the infirmary. The vet is a day's ride." He did not say, "Show me." He did not say, "Here is your chance." He stood on the porch with his arms at his sides, and he waited, and she understood that this was not a test in the way that Drummond had meant tests. This was a real problem that needed a real solution, and he was watching to see what she would do with that information. She set her saddle down. She did not put it against the fence or the barn wall. She set it down in the center of the yard where she could see it from the barn. She took off her coat. She handed it to Callum, who had appeared beside her with his notebook, and who took it without being asked and held it without comment. She walked toward the last barn. Inside the stall at the far end, ironclad was a black horse of perhaps 17 hands, and he was waging war against the walls of his confinement. His eyes were white-rimmed and rolling. His neck was dark with sweat that had already dried and was damp again. He moved in the tight space with the frantic energy of something that has convinced itself that the walls are closing in and that the only response to closing walls is to break them down. 2 men were outside the stall, pressed against the opposite wall, doing the thing people do when they know they should leave, but cannot quite make themselves leave. One of them had a length of rope coiled in his hands that he was not using because approaching the stall was not a thing he was willing to do. Marin walked past them to the stall gate. She did not open it. She stood outside it and looked through the slats at the horse, and the horse looked at her and kept moving, kept slamming, kept screaming. She stayed there. She did not move. She studied him the way you study a problem you have been given by someone who loves you with full attention and without the luxury of giving up. He was not mean. That was the first thing she understood. Mean horses moved differently. Mean horses had a kind of cold purpose in their violence. This horse was terrified. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. She began to talk. Not words, not exactly. The words were there. Technically, she was saying them in the correct order, but the words were almost beside the point. What she was producing was a quality of sound, a texture, and a cadence and a steadiness that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with the presence behind the language. Her father had called it the line same word he used for other things. The line between you and the animal, the line you had to lay down before any other work could be done. She talked about the mountains. She talked about grass in spring when the snow had finally committed to leaving. She talked about water running cold over stone. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She kept her feet planted. In the yard outside, Ward Harlow had come down from the porch. She could not see him. She knew without seeing. 10 minutes, 15. The horse's circling slowed, not because of magic, because the noise she was making was consistent and the presence she was offering was consistent, and the horse, which was not mean but was afraid, was beginning to ask itself the question that terrified things eventually ask, which is whether the thing it fears is actually present or whether the fear has simply gotten ahead of the facts. The ears shifted, one ear then both orienting toward the sound she was making. She began to move, not toward the horse, toward the gate latch. She opened it with one hand while she kept talking, swung it open, and stepped inside the stall. Ironclad bolted to the far corner. She let him go. She moved to the center of the stall and stood still and kept her voice running, kept it even, kept it present. Outside the stall, she heard nothing. The ranch had gone quiet in the way that working men go quiet when they are watching something they do not understand but cannot look away from. 20 minutes more. Her feet hurt. Her voice was beginning to tire. She let it be tired and kept it going. She took one step toward the horse. He held. She took another. He shifted his weight but did not bolt. She kept talking. When her hand touched his shoulder, it went through him like a current. He shuddered, all 1,600 pounds of him, a full-body tremor that passed from his neck to his hindquarters. Then a long, long exhale. His head dropped. She kept her hand where it was and kept talking, and after a while she was not really saying anything at all, and he was not shuddering anymore, and she walked him in a slow circle, and he came with her. She led him out of the stall and into the aisle of the barn, and through the barn door into the cold air of the yard, and when she walked out into the November gray, with her hand on Ironclad's neck and the horse walking beside her like a creature who had simply decided that walking beside her was the thing to do, the yard was as quiet as she had ever heard a working yard be. She walked him once around the perimeter. He went with her. His ears were forward now. His neck was still dark with the residue of dried sweat, but his eyes had settled, the white rim gone, the animal present in them again, instead of the panic. She brought him back to the barn door and stopped. She looked up. Ward Harlow was standing 6 feet away. He had crossed the yard at some point, and she had not noticed. He was looking at the horse, then at her with an expression she could not fully classify. It was not surprise exactly. It was the expression of a man who expected a thing and found it and cannot decide what he feels about finding it. "Who taught you that?" he said. His voice was quiet. "A soldier," she said. 3 seconds. He looked at her. The expression did not change, but something behind it moved, something in the region of his eyes. She had said a soldier without thinking about it, without performing it, and she saw in the way his face processed those two words that they landed differently than she had intended them to land. "Drummond," he said louder now, not looking away from her. "Get her a room. Main house, East Hall." A pause. "She starts today." He turned and walked back toward the porch and went up the steps and through the front door. And the door closed behind him, and the yard came back to life around her, men returning to their work tools, resuming their sounds. The ranch swallowing the moment the way a river swallows a stone. Drummond appeared at her shoulder. Close enough that it was a choice. "Don't mistake quiet for agreement," he said. He kept his voice below the general noise of the yard so that only she could hear it. "The boss has his reasons for what he does. The rest of us have our own." She looked at him. She let the silence sit. "I'm sure you do," she said. She picked up her saddle from the center of the yard and followed him toward the main house. The room was at the end of the east hall on the ground floor, small, but with a window that looked out over the yard and one of the barn structures. A cot, a washstand, a chair, a wardrobe with a crooked door. The East Hall room had no lock on its door. She noted that on the first day and decided it was not a problem she could solve, only one she needed to keep in mind. Drummond showed her the room without ceremony, the way you show a room to someone you expect will not be in it long, and left. She set the saddle on the floor. Not against the wall, not on the wardrobe, on the floor in the center of the room, upright, where she could see it. She sat on the edge of the cot and looked at it. The leather cord that covered the fender was still in place. She reached out and touched it, then pulled her hand back. The saddle had belonged to her father. Every seam, every scar in the leather was memory. The maker's mark on the back of the cantle, the way the left stirrup hung half an inch lower than the right because her father had ridden for 10,000 miles, and the leather had adjusted to him. The smell of it, even now, even after a year and more of her ownership, was his smell underneath everything else. Horses and saddle soap and the cold air of a Pennsylvania morning. And the thing beneath the cord, the thing she had covered, a mark pressed into the leather-worn but legible, a shield with a crossed saber and a numeral, the mark of the 7th Cavalry. She had covered it in Philadelphia when she realized that Sergeant Thomas Quinn's name was in the regimental records and that a woman traveling alone with a cavalry saddle would generate questions she did not yet know how to answer. She had covered it and called herself the widow of a soldier, which was true in the sense that she had been a soldier's family, which was all the truth she could afford at the time. She had not expected the truth to matter here in the way that it might matter. She had not expected to find herself in a ranch owned by Ward Harlow. She did not know yet what she expected. There were footsteps in the hall, not passing, pausing, outside her door, not knocking, just present, for a moment, then continuing. She recognized the weight of them from the yard. That cadence. Ward Harlow walking alone in his own house at the end of an afternoon. She sat with the saddle and she breathed. That evening near dark, she was in the east corridor going to the washroom when she passed the room the men used for storage and found the door 2 inches open. Not because she was prying, because the lamp inside was lit and she had reflexively noted the light the way she noted anything that was out of place in a familiar landscape. Inside the small room, on a rough shelf among account books and supply ledgers, a thin notebook lay open. Not open as if someone was reading it, open as if someone had set it down in haste or had forgotten to close it. She stood in the doorway and she was not going to look at it. Then she looked at it. The page it was open to was a record of horse sales. Dates in the left column, descriptions in the middle, amounts in the right. She scanned it the way her father had scanned landscapes, looking for the thing that did not belong. He had taught her accounting from a basic ledger when she was 9, the same year he taught her to read horse teeth for age on the same principle. Everything has a system, and the system tells you when something has gone wrong. The numbers in this notebook did not match the numbers she had seen briefly in the main ledger, on the desk in the front hall when Drummond had passed by and left the ledger open. She had not been looking at the ledger intentionally. She had simply looked at it the way she looked at everything, and her mind had held the numbers without asking her permission. These numbers were higher, by amounts that were not errors. She stepped back from the door. She went to the washroom and she washed her hands and she looked at her own face in the small, wavy mirror above the basin. She put the notebook back into the part of her mind that was for things that needed to be held but not yet acted on. She had no evidence beyond a set of numbers she had happened to see, and a different set that she had happened to remember. She was a woman who had been in this place for approximately 4 hours. She had no standing, no history, no credit with anyone here, except perhaps one man who had seen her walk a terrified horse out of a barn. She needed time. She needed more information. She needed to not be seen going anywhere near that room again. She went back down the hall and into her room and she closed the door. The saddle was where she had left it, upright in the center of the room. She looked at it for a long time. She was carrying 2 things now inside her. 2 things that could not be shown to anyone yet. The truth about whose saddle this was and the truth about what was written in a notebook on a shelf in the East Corridor storage room. Either one of them could end her time here before it properly began. She lay down on the cot without undressing her coat over her like a blanket, and she looked at the ceiling. Later, much later, when the ranch had been dark and quiet for a long time, she heard footsteps in the hall, heavy and slow. They stopped outside her door. She held completely still, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from a kind of attention she could not name, a listening that went beyond her ears. The footsteps stood there for perhaps half a minute. She counted her own heartbeats. Then they moved away down the hall toward the front of the house. A door opened and closed. She let out her breath. She reached out in the dark and put her hand on the saddle where it stood beside the cot. Her fingers found the leather cord, felt the shape of what was underneath it. She did not know who Ward Harlow was to her father's story. She did not know what he knew or what he suspected, or why he had stood outside her door in the dark and said nothing and gone away again. She only knew that she was here, that she was still here, that she had been here for one day and had not been sent away, and that the saddle was still in the room with her, the one thing she had not sold and would not sell, the one line that had not crossed. She closed her eyes. Outside, the November snow had made its decision and was coming down for real now, steady and without drama, covering the yard and the barns and the mountains beyond, covering everything equally the way winter always does, making the world clean and unreadable, and knew hiding what it found and letting nothing hide from its own cold. In Coldwater Creek, they would tell this story for years, about the woman who came off the train with a dead man's saddle and eyes that did not look down, about what she had walked into and what she had walked out of and what she had carried the whole time without anyone knowing the weight of it. But that part of the story had not happened yet. For now there was only the snow and the dark and the saddle standing guard beside the cot, and Maren Quinn-Weller lying in the narrow room at the end of the East Hall, with her hand resting on leather that smelled of her father, and her eyes finally, after a very long day, closing. The mare's name was Clover, and she was dying by inches in the dark. Maren heard her before she saw her. She had been awake already as she was most mornings at Harlow's Peak, lying in the narrow cot in the East Hall room and listening to the ranch come alive in the pre-dawn dark. The sounds were becoming familiar now, 2 weeks into her time here. The specific creak of the main barn door when Callum opened it at 4:30. The rhythm of the smithy bellows when Beckett started his fire. The way the wind came down off the upper ridge and hit the north face of the house differently than it hit the south face, a lower note more sustained. She had learned to read the ranch by sound the way her father had taught her to read terrain by sight. Information was information. The medium did not matter. The sound that reached her before first light on this particular morning was not part of the established vocabulary. It was high and broken and continuous, and it was coming from the small foaling barn at the southwest corner of the yard. She was dressed and moving before she had finished identifying what she was hearing. Outside, the cold hit her like a palm against the face. November had committed itself fully now. The yard was iron hard underfoot, the puddles from the last snow frozen into shallow mirrors that caught nothing in the dark. She crossed to the foaling barn at a run and came through the door into the smell of panic blood and the sweat of an animal in extremis. Clover was a bay mare, first foaling, and the foal was wrong. Maren could see it in the mare's movements, the way she dropped and rose and dropped again, the inefficiency of it, the effort going nowhere. 2 of the ranch hands were inside the stall, one holding a lamp, one with a rope, both pressed against the boards in the way of men who know something is needed and do not know what it is. Silas Drummond stood at the stall gate with his arms crossed in an expression that was managing a situation from a distance, which was not the same as solving it. "She's been at it 2 hours," he said, addressed to the room and not to Maren, who had just arrived. She pushed past him to the stall gate and looked in. "You're losing both of them," she said. "And what would you know about it?" he said. It was not a question. She unlatched the gate and went in. The mare was down again, sides heaving. Maren moved to her head first, not to the foal's problem, but to the source of the panic, and she put her hands on the mare's neck, and she began to talk the same quality of sound she had used with Ironclad, the same steady, unremarkable presence. "Look here, I am here. Nothing is closing in. Get me clean water," she said, "hot as you can make it this time of morning, and cloth, clean cloth, not rope." A pause. Then the sound of someone moving, one of the younger hands, not Drummond, making the choice that needed making. She worked with her coat off, and her sleeves rolled past the elbows, and her hands doing things that lived in the body and not in the mind, knowledge that cannot be explained but only passed from one set of hands to another. The foal was backward. She had seen it twice before, once in Pennsylvania, and once on the journey west, a farmer's mare in Ohio who had let Maren ride in the back of a wagon for 20 miles in exchange for help with a difficult birth. The principle was the same: patience and angle, and the understanding that force was the enemy of the thing you were trying to accomplish. Drummond appeared at the stall gate again. "You're going to kill her pulling like that," he said. "I'm not pulling," she said without turning. "That's the difference." She heard him shift his weight. She heard from somewhere behind him the sound of heavier footsteps approaching the barn door, and she did not turn to look because she could not look at anything except the mare in the work. It took 40 minutes. By the end of it, her arms were slicked to the elbows and her knees hurt from the stall floor, and the lamp had been refilled once. The mare had been still for the last 15 minutes, not from exhaustion, but from some animal apprehension of what was happening that was not exactly calm, but was the absence of active resistance. The foal came with a rush and landed in the straw and lay still for the 3 seconds that are always the longest 3 seconds, and then moved all four legs simultaneously, the instinctive and improbable scramble of a new creature, discovering that it has a body. The mare turned her head, then her whole neck. She made a sound deep in her chest that was not any sound Marin had a word for, and reached out her nose toward the foal, and the foal reached back with the same instinct. Marin sat back on her heels. She was shaking slightly, which was the body's invoice for the work it had done arriving after the fact. She let it shake. She pressed the back of her wrist to her forehead and looked at the foal, a bay colt with a white star legs like bundled sticks already trying to find his feet. "Well," said a voice from the barn door. She turned. Ward Harlow was standing in the doorway with the cold dark behind him, and the lamp making the left side of his face bright and the right side shadow. He was looking at the colt. His expression was the expression of a man who has seen difficult things end badly often enough that when a difficult thing ends well, he allows himself a moment of unguarded acknowledgement before the guard comes back. He looked from the colt to Marin. She was aware of what she looked like. She was aware of her arms and her condition, and she did not apologize for any of it. "Drummond said you were interfering," Ward said. "The foal was backwards," she said. "They would have both died." He looked at her for a moment that went 2 or 3 seconds past what was strictly informational. "See that you get a meal before you start on the morning work," he said. He turned and walked back into the dark. She looked at the space where he had been. Then she looked at the colt who had achieved a standing position and then immediately reconsidered it and was now trying again with more commitment. She smiled at him. She was not aware of smiling. It simply happened. That evening, when she came back from the barn at last light, there was a tray outside her room door. Beef, thick sliced. Roasted potatoes, a piece of cornbread still faintly warm. No note, no name. She sat on the cot with the tray on her lap, and she ate everything on it. When she was done, she set the tray on the floor, and she put our shots in her hands. Not in despair, not in grief. She sat like that for a little while because she needed to, because the thing she was feeling did not have a shape yet, and she needed to give it time to find one. What she was feeling was something close to the word relief, but bigger than that word, and with an edge on it that relief did not usually carry. Something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you had been carrying so long that you had stopped noticing it was there, and in the moment of setting it down, noticing all at once the full measure of what it had cost you to carry it. She had not had a hot meal that she had not cooked herself in 7 months. She had not had one that someone else had cooked and left for her because they thought she had earned it. She let herself cry briefly with her face in her hands in the small room. Then she washed her face in the basin and went to bed. The days settled into a shape after that. She woke before the rest of the ranch. She was in the main barn before Callum, which he noted on the first morning, with raised eyebrows, and accepted on the second morning as an established fact, sliding his notebook onto the same shelf where it always went, and beginning his own work without discussion. They moved around each other in the barn with the naturalness of people who understand that good work does not require conversation, only attention. He had the notebook with him always. She had stopped wondering what was in it and started occasionally asking, and he showed her without ceremony. Weather observations, feeding schedules, the notation system he had developed for tracking the health of each animal in his care, a private shorthand that condensed a horse's condition into 3 numbers and a letter. It was elegant in the way that practical solutions developed by careful people over time are elegant, the elegance of fitness of a thing being exactly what it needed to be and nothing more. She showed him her own system in return. A cavalry horsemaster's approach that emphasized what she thought of as the social dimension of a horse's health, not just the physical condition, but the relational one. Whether the animal was at ease with the people around it, whether the circumstances of its housing were working with its nature or against it. Callum listened with the focused attention he brought to everything worth paying attention to. He made notes. He said after a while, "This would explain ironclad." And she said yes, and they looked at each other with the satisfaction of people who have found a language they share. She came to understand over those first weeks that each of the Harlow brothers occupied a different weather system, and that learning how each system worked was simply part of living among them. Callum was clear and cool. A high-pressure day. What you saw was what was there. No storm coming. His intelligence ran fast and quiet, and he offered it without self-congratulation. He was the easiest person she had ever known to simply be near. Beckett was weather that announced itself big and warm and present. He came into a room and the room knew about it. He worked at the forge with the complete physical commitment of someone who had found the exact right relationship between his body and his occupation. The hammer going with the weight of the whole man behind it. The metal responding the way metal responds to someone who understands what it wants to become. He made her laugh twice in the first week, which surprised her both times. On the fourth day, she was passing the smithy door, and he called out to her without looking up from the anvil. "Come tell me what you think of this," he said. She went in. He was working on a set of hinge hardware for the new folding stall gate, and he held up the piece he was finishing and turned it in the firelight. She looked at the angle of the hinge plate and said, "The load is going to pull it left. The grain of the weld is off by about 10 degrees. He turned it back toward himself and looked at it, then looked at her. "Huh," he said, the same sound he had made in the wagon on the first day. Then after a moment, "You're right. My father showed me," she said. "He said the shape of iron under stress tells you what it needs the same way a horse does." Beckett's face did something brief and complicated. Then he put the piece back on the anvil and said, "Your father sounds like he was something." She looked at the fire in the forge. "He was," she said. She left it there. "He did not press." She added that to her understanding of him, the accumulating picture she was building about the three brothers she was living among. Ward she was building more slowly than the others. He appeared in the main barn on the fourth evening, not to inspect or to direct, but simply to be there. She kept doing what she was doing, working down the near side of Ironclad's leg, where a small cut from the previous week was healing well, but needed daily attention. Ward did not speak. He sat with his forearms on his knees and he looked at the horses the way she looked at landscapes, collecting information, noting things. Once he rose and moved to look at one of the yearlings across the aisle, checking something in the way the animal was standing, and he did it with a quietness of movement that registered in the barn as not a threat, the horses not shifting or reacting, which told her something about how long he had been moving through spaces that animals occupied. On the sixth evening, he came to the tack room while she was mending a bridle with a broken strap. She had the lamp going and a length of leather thread in her fingers, and the work was the kind of work she had always found, settling the needle going through with pressure and returning with the small satisfaction of a row of tight stitches. He came in and stood for a moment and then moved to the workbench along the wall. He picked up a rein that had been left there cracked and dry, in need of conditioning at minimum and probably replacement. He ran his thumb along the inside surface. "There's a kind of memory in old leather," he said. He was not speaking to her exactly. He was speaking in the way that a person speaks when a thought surfaces and they do not make the effort to keep it inside. The weight of a hand, the way a horse carried it. She stopped her needle. "My father used to say that," she said. And then she heard what she had said and something went still inside her because she had not meant to say it. He turned and looked at her. "Your father," he said, quiet, careful. Two words doing the work of a question without committing to being one. "He worked with leather for a time," she said. She returned to her needle. Her hands were steady. She had learned over the years to keep her hands steady while the rest of her was doing something else. Before other work. Ward looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled the stool from under the bench and sat down and began working the cracked rein with the conditioning oil that was kept on the shelf, and they worked side by side in the lamp light, without speaking, for the better part of an hour. The only sounds were his tools and her thread, and outside the barn, the silence of a mountain night which is not truly silent, but is quiet in a way that a city is never quiet, a quiet with depth and intention. When she stood to leave, he said her name. Just that, just her name, the first time he had used it, and it was different than she had expected it to be, solid and unperformed, the name as a word rather than as a courtesy. She paused at the door. "The stitching is clean," he said. "You do good work." She went back to the East Hall room with her heart doing something it had not done in a long time, and she did not examine it closely because she was not ready for what the examination might tell her. What she was ready for was what Silas Drummond was doing. She had been building the case quietly from the ground up, from detail to detail, until the weight of the details became undeniable. The number she had seen in the storage room notebook and the number she had seen in the main ledger were not a coincidence or an error. She had now seen 3 more pages glimpsed on 2 separate occasions when the storage room door was left open and the book was left visible, not because Drummond was careless, but because he had been doing this long enough that his caution had relaxed into habit. Habit was where people made mistakes. She counted 8 months of transactions that did not reconcile. She noted the specific horses involving and cross-referencing with the feeding records she had legitimate access to in the barn. She noted the amounts. She built the picture on paper she kept folded inside a small pocket she had sewn into the lining of her coat years ago for things that needed to travel with her. She did not have everything she needed yet. She needed one more piece, a specific sale record that she had not yet been able to verify from the legitimate books. She kept her face neutral and her behavior unchanged, and she waited. In the meantime, Drummond was doing his own work. She found her hoof knife in the wrong location. 3 mornings running moved from where she had placed it with the deliberate care of someone who knows that tools in the wrong place cost time and in certain situations cost more than time. She found a gate she had latched open at a moment when it could have allowed 2 yearlings into the main yard during a period of heavy traffic. She found that the new hands brought on for the winter work had been told things about her that she could not directly disprove and could not directly address without making the accusation that Drummond had been the one to say them. She said nothing. She'd latched the gate. She found the hoof knife and put it back. She doubled her own vigilance and she waited. On the day the blizzard came, she had been at Harlow's Peak for 4.5 weeks. She felt it coming before the sky showed it. The horses were the first signal, the subtle change in their behavior that precedes a major weather event. The restlessness that is not distress, but is watchfulness, the body preparing for what the body knows before the mind does. She said nothing to anyone at first. She watched the sky to the northwest, and she watched the horses, and at 2 in the afternoon she went to Ward, where he was reviewing supply lists in the main house, and said simply, "You have until dark to get everything secure. The storm is going to be serious." He looked at her. "The barometer has been steady," he said. "The horses say different," she said. He looked at her for a moment more. Then he put down the supply list and went to the door and looked at the sky, and then he called for Beckett and Drummond, and the storm preparation began. Ward gave Drummond the specific task of securing Ironclad. Ironclad had a stall in the secondary barn that was separate from the main herd, a concession to his temperament. The door to his barn had a particular latch, a 2-throw iron latch that required a deliberate action, not the kind of thing a wind could undo. Drummond was assigned to it directly in front of 3 other men, with Ward looking at him as he gave the instruction. She watched Drummond's face as he received the instruction. She watched it carefully. She was good at watching things carefully. She saw what she saw, and she filed it. The storm hit at 7 in the evening, and within 2 hours it was the worst she had seen in Colorado. A white wall of wind and driven snow that turned the 40 feet between the main house and the nearest barn into a journey requiring a rope line. The windows rattled. The fire in the main house fireplace leaned sideways in the drafts coming through the walls. The sounds of the storm covered everything else, layering and building until the whole world was that sound. She was in her room when she woke from a light doze at 11 and knew the knowing was not dramatic. It was the absence of something. A sound she had been tracking unconsciously in the general storm noise. A sound that was no longer there. The percussion of a specific horse in a specific structure. A pattern she had absorbed over 4 weeks of pre-dawn mornings. Ironclad stall sounds were gone from the storm noise. She dressed. She put on every layer she had, coat over coat, and she wrapped her scarf twice. She took the rope from the hook on the back of her door, the one she had put there on the second day after noting that the ranch's storm rope protocol call involved lines between buildings, and she went out the back door of the East Hall into the storm. The cold was another thing entirely. The daytime cold she had grown accustomed to was a rational thing at temperature. This was a force. It moved through her layers without asking permission. She put her head down and she went to the secondary barn by feel and memory rather than sight, and she found the door swinging in the storm, the two-throw iron latch undone. She stood for a moment in the doorway, with the storm coming over her and the empty stall in front of her, and she made her calculation. The horse had been gone at most an hour. The tracks would be covered, but the direction was knowable. Ironclad in a storm would run with the wind, not against it. He would look for shelter in the only available shelter east of the secondary barn. In the direction the wind was pushing was the draw cut into the mountain face 3/4 of a mile out. She got her horse. She got Daisy from the main barn, working fast in the dark, and she saddled her with hands that were already losing sensation in their tips, and she led her out into the storm and mounted. She was 100 yards from the barn when the second set of hoofbeats came up behind her and then beside her, and she turned her face into the wind and wind-driven snow to look, and there were 3 horses and 3 riders, dark shapes in the white, and she could not read their faces in the dark, but she knew them by the way they sat their horses, the weight of each man, the posture that belonged to each of them. Beckett pulled alongside her. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted over the wind. She could hear the fear in it, and she understood the fear, and she did not take it as criticism. "Drummond left the latch undone," she shouted back. "The wind didn't do it. The latch takes 2 throws." A pause. The wind hammered them. Then Ward's voice from her other side, cutting through the noise, with the quality of a voice that has given orders in bad conditions and has not wasted breath doing it. "Beckett East. Callum stay with her horse. Marin." She looked toward him. She could see only the outline of him, the bulk of the coat, the set of the shoulders. "With me," he said. They rode into the draw together. She knew where she was going, and he followed her lead without question, which she registered but did not have time to think about. The draw was a natural funnel for wind-driven animals. Animals in panic do not create their own direction, but surrender to the landscape's direction, and the landscape here had only one direction east of the secondary barn. She found ironclad by sound before sight, the high distress calling of a horse that has found itself trapped, rising even above the storm. He was in the narrow part of the draw where it kinked before opening, caught with his left foreleg, wedged in a rock crevice, filled with ice and frozen debris. He was not injured, or not badly, but he was leveraging against the trap with increasingly exhausted panic, and if he went down in the narrow space, he would not get up. She dismounted in the wind and went to him. Ward came up beside her and looked at the situation with the rapid assessment of someone who has solved physical problems under time pressure before, and he went to the horse's rear without being asked to do it, positioning himself to prevent the animal from backing further into the trap while she worked at the foreleg. The ice in the crevice was the problem. She did not have tools for it, but she had the technique for ice-cold situations where tools were not available, patience and heat, and the specific application of her own body warmth to the joint of the problem. She worked at it with her hands, and she talked to the horse, and Ward held the position behind, and Beckett arrived from the east at some point and added his weight and his strength to the problem, and Callum arrived and put himself at the horse's head on the other side. When the leg came free, they were all 4 of them present for it, and the horse lunged forward and found his footing and stood there in the wind, trembling but upright, and she put her hand on his neck, and he led her. They brought him back through the storm together. They moved slowly and with the collective efficiency of people who have been reduced by extreme circumstances to nothing but the task and each other, all other considerations stripped away by cold and wind and the necessity of moving forward. She did not register that she was shaking until they were back inside the main barn with the storm shut out behind them. She registered it then with some surprise, as if her body had been waiting for permission. Ward came from behind her and put his coat over her shoulders, not asking, simply doing it, the heavy wool descending over her with a weight that was also warmth that smelled of cold and horses and the man who wore it most days. His hands rested on her shoulders for a moment, steadying her where she stood, and she felt the pressure of them through the wool and through the layers beneath it. "You could have been killed," he said. He was close behind her. His voice was very quiet. "Your horse would have died by morning," she said. Her own voice came out rougher than she expected. "That is not," he said and paused and started again. "That is a different point." She turned to look at him, which meant turning inside the circle of his proximity, and he did not step back. His face in the barn lamplight was the face of a man who had been frightened in a way that had gotten past his management of it and who was currently deciding whether to let her see that or to close it back down. He let her see it. She understood in the way that certain things arrive all at once rather than being built up gradually, that this man had been afraid for her, not for the horse, for her. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything more about it. They rode back to the main house with Beckett and Callum ahead of them, and Ward stayed at her side through the wind close enough that there was shelter in the closeness, and she did not put distance between them. The morning after the storm, the ranch was still and white and strange, with the altered silence that follows great noise. The smithy found the latch of the secondary barn with a tool he was not meant to have found it with, because it had been placed there deliberately to prevent the second throw from catching. He brought it to Ward. Ward held it and looked at it. Then he looked toward the main house, toward the window of the room where Silas Drummond had already been reported to be at breakfast, and his face went very quiet in the way that faces go quiet when a decision has been made, and what remains is only the timing of the execution. Callum had come to stand beside him. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "She knows horses the way Quinn knew them." Ward looked at the latch in his hand. He did not respond. He did not need to. That night, Marin lay on her cot and listened to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds. She heard Ward's office door close. She heard much later the slow steps in the hall that were his steps and no one else's pausing in the east corridor. A paper appeared under her door. She rose and picked it up. 4 words in a clear military hand. "Are you all right?" She found her pencil on the washstand. She wrote 1 word under his question. She pushed it back under the door. The steps in the corridor moved away. She went back to the cot and lay down. She was in this place, and it was becoming known to her and she to it. The saddle stood in the room with her, its covered mark quiet in the dark. Both its secrets and her own, held in the same careful suspension, waiting for the weight of time and circumstance to bring them to their proper moment. She closed her eyes. Outside, the snow that had nearly killed her and Ward's horse lay still and thick and permanent-looking. Over everything, the way the heaviest snows always look, as though they intend to stay forever, as though the spring that will dissolve them is a rumor from another country. It was not. But she would need all of winter first. She was ready for winter. She had always been ready for winter. The Sunday morning gathering was a Harlow's Peak tradition that Ward had established in the first year of the ranch's operation, not from any particular religious conviction, but from the practical understanding that a collection of men working in isolation needed at least one moment each week when they were reminded they were part of something larger than their individual tasks. He kept it brief. He covered the work of the week past and the work of the week ahead. He answered questions. He dismissed them. It took typically 20 minutes. Marin had attended every one since her arrival. She stood at the back of the main storage barn, where the gatherings were held among the men she had come to know by their working habits and their small daily courtesies, and she listened and she watched, and she said nothing unless directly addressed. She had learned in those weeks that silence in a group was a different instrument than silence alone, and she was still learning how to play it here. She had been in the main barn since before 4 that morning, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the quality of her attention that morning, the way it kept snagging on things and pulling back like a hem caught on a nail. She had slept badly. The paper exchange through the door 2 nights before was still with her, Ward's 4-word question, and her 1-word answer, the simplicity of it, that somehow contained more than any longer exchange had managed. She had gone about her morning work with the slight distraction of someone carrying a new weight and not yet calibrated to it. She did not see Drummond go into the main house. She did not see him come out. She had been away from the East Hall since before 4 in the morning. She had not thought about the unlocked door. She thought about it now, standing in the gathering space when she saw what he was holding. She came to the gathering from the barn at 7, stomping the mud from her boots at the door, and she took her place at the back, and she looked toward the front, where Ward was about to begin, and she did not immediately understand what she was seeing when Silas Drummond stepped forward from the side wall with his arms crossed and something held against his chest. Then she understood. The saddle was her father's saddle, the brown leather gone dark with age, and used the familiar weight of it wrong in Drummond's hands offensive in them, the way a private thing is offensive when a stranger handles it without permission. He had it pressed to his chest with both arms crossed over it, holding it the way you hold something you intend to use. He waited until the room was fully quiet. He had a sense of occasion, Drummond. He had the timing of a man who had rehearsed this. "Before the boss gets to the spring plans," he said, addressing the room in the voice he used when he was managing rather than speaking, "I think there's something this outfit needs to know about the woman we've been housing in the main house this past month." The room went still in the way a room of working men goes still when something personal is about to be made public. Not silence exactly, the cessation of secondary motion, the awareness of the people near you. Marin kept her eyes forward. She felt Beckett, who was standing 6 feet to her left, shift his weight toward her. Not dramatically, a half-step, the movement of someone adjusting their position to be nearer to something. Drummond turned the saddle and showed the fender to the room. Even across the distance, she could see it. The leather cord she had tied over the marking had been removed. The shield with the cross saber and the numeral 7 was visible to everyone present, worn but legible, unmistakable. "This is a 7th Cavalry saddle," Drummond said. "Government issue, the kind that gets assigned to a man who serves and gets buried with him, or sent home to his family when he doesn't." He paused for effect. He was good at pauses. "I checked the regimental records. There is no Edward Weller in the 7th Cavalry. Not in any company, not in any year of service. No Edward Weller served in that regiment at all." The murmur that moved through the room was low and immediate. "She told us her husband was the soldier," Drummond continued. "She used that story to get through the door. The story is a lie. The husband was a clerk. He was never in uniform a day of his life." He looked at Marin directly. Not with anger, with the satisfied expression of someone completing a transaction they have been working toward for some time. "This saddle was stolen off a dead man on the trail, or taken some other way she hasn't seen fit to explain. And the woman carrying it and the stories she's been telling since she got here are not what they have been represented to be." He set the saddle down on the nearest work surface. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at Ward. "I think the outfit deserves to know," he said, "before we go any further." The room looked at Ward, then at Marin, then back at Ward, as rooms do when they are waiting to find out which direction the authority intends to move. Marin looked at Ward. He was standing at the front of the gathering space with his hands at his sides and his face in the configuration she had come to know as his neutral face, which was not the same as an empty face. Behind the neutral face, things were always moving. She had spent a month learning to read what moved there, and she could see now that several things were moving at once, and that the speed of their movement was higher than usual. He was not going to speak first. She understood that. He was waiting to see what she would do, the same way he had waited in the yard on the first day to see what she would do with Ironclad, not because he did not care about the outcome, but because what she did on her own was information he needed. She took a breath. She said loud enough for the back of the room to hear, "He's right." The murmur that followed was different from the first one, higher and more confused. "My husband was not a soldier. Edward Weller was a clerk in a shipping office in Philadelphia, and he was a good man, and he is dead. The saddle did not belong to him." She looked at Drummond, then let her eyes travel to the saddle on the work surface, and then she looked back at the room. "It belonged to my father." She paused. "My father's name was Sergeant Thomas Quinn. He served in the 7th Cavalry out of Fort Lincoln. He rode with that regiment for 11 years. She paused again, and this pause was not for effect, but because the name said aloud in this room, in this company, had a weight she had not anticipated. He was killed in action in June of 1876 at a place called Raven Canyon in Montana Territory. I was 11 years old. The room was very quiet. I came west using my husband's name because I believed, and I was probably right to believe, that no one would take seriously a woman who claimed to know horses on her own account. I let people assume the soldier in the story was my husband instead of my father because it was easier than the truth and because I needed the work." She looked at her hands briefly. "I was wrong to do that. I am sorry for it." She raised her head. Her voice was steady. "But I am not sorry for knowing horses. I am not sorry for the work I have done here. And I am not sorry for the fact that this saddle is mine by right and by grief, because my father earned it, and I am the only family he left behind to carry it. The silence that followed was the silence of people who have been given more than they expected and do not yet know what to do with the surplus. Then Ward spoke. He did not look at Drummond when he began. He looked at Marin, and what was in his face was not the neutral face. The neutral face was gone. What was there instead was something that had been held behind it for a longer time and had now in this specific moment decided to be present. Thomas Quinn, he said, was the finest soldier I served with in 11 years of service. The room went still in a different way than before. He saved my life at Raven Canyon in the summer of 1876. Our scouting party was ambushed from two positions in the draw. Sergeant Quinn was to my left when the first volley came. He moved between me and the second volley. Ward paused. The pause was not managed. It was the pause of a man for whom the next words cost something real. He took a round that was addressed to me. I pulled him out of the fire line. It was not in time to matter. He walked forward from the front of the room. The men between him and Marin moved aside without being asked the natural movement of a space opening up for him, the way spaces open for Ward Harlow when he moved with intention. He stopped in front of her. He spoke before he died. He said his daughter knew horses better than any man in his troop. Ward looked at her steadily. I have been a cavalry officer and a rancher for many years, and I have known perhaps 4 people in my life who understood horses the way you understand them. He told me I would recognize her when I found her. He was right. He turned to face the room. Marin Quinn is the daughter of a man who died in my service and in my debt. She has a right to be on this land that precedes any contract in any arrangement. Anyone who cannot work alongside her can collect their pay at the end of the week. He turned back to her. The neutral face was still gone. This is your place, he said, quietly, only for her. It was your place before you got here. I was just slow in understanding that. In the following silence, Drummond's voice came from the side of the room, flat and hard. This doesn't change what she is. She came in here with a false name and a stolen story, and the boss is letting sentiment cloud his Silas. Ward said the name the way you say the one word that ends a conversation. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn toward Drummond when he said it. He kept his eyes on Marin, which was its own kind of statement, the choice of where to look when a man is speaking. Then he turned. Marin reached into the inside pocket of her coat and took out the folded paper she had been carrying there for 3 weeks, written on paper she kept behind the sewn pocket in the lining, the columns of numbers with their dates and descriptions and amounts. She unfolded it once and placed it on the work surface beside her father's saddle. There is also this, she said. She did not raise her voice. She addressed Ward directly. The notebook in the East Corridor storage room contains sale records for 8 months of horse transactions. The amounts in that notebook are higher than the amounts recorded in the main ledger for the same transactions. I first saw the notebook on my 4th day here. I spent 3 weeks verifying the discrepancy against the feeding records and the supply accounts I had legitimate access to. She looked at Drummond without expression. The difference between the notebook figures and the ledger figures over 8 months is approximately $480. I can show you which transactions and which dates. The room was not just quiet now. The room was the specific quality of silence that forms when something inevitable has finally arrived. Drummond's face went through several configurations in quick succession. The last one it settled on was the one that belonged to a man who has run out of moves and knows it, but has not yet decided whether to accept that knowledge or spend what remains of his position fighting it. Ward crossed to the work surface and picked up her paper. He read it the way he did everything completely and without performance, his eyes moving through the columns at the pace of a man who understands numbers and is confirming what he already suspects. He set the paper down. He looked at Drummond. Silas. One word. The weight of 9 years of employment and trust, and the specific betrayal of both in that single name. You will collect your belongings from the bunkhouse. You will be off this land before first light tomorrow. If I see your face on Harlow's Peak property after that, I will send for the county sheriff, and I will give him this paper, and I will let the law take the length of it. Drummond opened his mouth. There is nothing you can say, Ward said, that changes the numbers. The two men who had been Drummond's allies in the bunkhouse looked at the floor. The rest of the room looked at Ward. Drummond looked at Marin with an expression that had several things in it, none of them simple, and she held his eyes without stepping back. And after a moment, he looked away. He picked up his hat from the nail by the door. He went out. The gathering dispersed with the muted efficiency of people who have witnessed something that requires processing and have the good instinct to process it somewhere other than the location where it occurred. Within 4 minutes, the storage barn was empty, except for the four of them and Dot Pierce, who had come from the kitchen when she heard the change in the morning sounds, and who looked at the four of them with the expression of a woman who has seen a great deal of life and has learned to assess a room's temperature accurately. She looked at the saddle on the work surface. She looked at Marin. She said, "I'll have supper on at 6," and went back to the kitchen. Beckett let out a long breath. It was the sound of a man who has been holding something in for the duration of an event and is now releasing it carefully the way you release pressure from a vessel you are not sure of. Well, he said, "That's done then." Callum was writing in his notebook. He wrote for a moment without looking up, then looked up and looked at Marin. "You kept the ledger in your coat," he said. "For 3 weeks," she said. He wrote something else. She did not ask what. Ward picked up the saddle from the work surface. He carried it the way she carried it, with the ease of someone who understands the weight distribution of the object, who has perhaps handled similar objects many times. He brought it to her and held it out. She took it. The leather was familiar under her hands, the worn skirts and the familiar hang of the left stirrup, and underneath her fingers where the cord had been removed, the pressed mark of the shield and the saber, and the number that meant the regiment her father had given his life to. She stood with it for a moment. "Come to supper," Ward said. Not to the room, to her. She looked at him. "All of us," he said, "at 6. He walked out of the storage barn into the winter morning, and Beckett followed him after touching her shoulder briefly with one hand, the gesture of a man who has decided that certain things do not need to be spoken to be meant. And Callum closed his notebook and went after them, and she was left alone in the barn with her father's saddle and the winter light coming through the gaps in the boards, and everything changed and everything somehow still standing. She brought the saddle back to her room. She set it in its place. She put her hand on it on the uncovered mark, and she let herself feel the full dimensions of the morning, the height and the depth of it, the thing that had been braced for and the thing that had not been anticipated. Ward's voice saying Thomas Quinn's name in a room full of men as though the name deserved to be said aloud. She washed her face and her hands, and she sat on the edge of the cot, and she looked out the window at the ranch yard where the men were returning to their work. The ordinary work of a working day, resuming around the extraordinary thing that had just happened. The way ordinary life always resumes because it must, because the horses still need feeding and the winter still needs managing, regardless of what has shifted in the human world. She watched Ward cross the yard toward the main barn. He moved the way he always moved without wasted motion, but she thought, watching him now with the context she had not had before, that there was something different in the set of his shoulders today. A fraction less of the contained quality, the sense of a man carrying something he had organized himself around without putting it down. She was not ready to name what she was feeling. She was not sure there was a name that fitted cleanly. It was too large for the words she had available and too specific for the general ones. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere after a long journey, but arriving somewhere that was not the destination you had planned for, somewhere better and stranger, and requiring more of you than the planned destination would have. She looked at the saddle. She looked at the window. She got up and went back to work. Dot put a pot of venison stew on the table at 6 and a loaf of bread and a plate of cold butter and 4 bowls, and she set the lamp in the center so the light fell on all of them equally, and she went back to her own room in the way of someone who understands the difference between being needed and being wanted and knows which one she is in a given moment. Marin sat across from Ward. Beckett was to her left and Callum to her right, and the first few minutes had the slight formality of people in a new configuration, the adjustment of a room that has changed its arrangements and is settling into them. Then Ward said, "He talked about you." She looked up. "Quinn." Ward turned his bowl once in his hands, not drinking from it yet. "The night before the ambush, we were in camp outside Raven Canyon. He and I had pulled the last watch together. He talked about the ranch where he'd grown up the horses, a man named Hicks, who had taught him everything about them. A pause. And about his daughter. He said she had his eye for a horse and better hands than he'd ever had. He said she'd been riding since before she could properly walk. Marin set her spoon down. He was telling you, she said, because he thought he might not come back. Yes, Ward said. She looked at the lamp. Her father's face was there in the way it was always there when she thought about him directly. Not an image exactly, but a quality of presence, the specific gravity of a person who loved you. He hated cows, she said. Across the table, Ward's face did something she had not seen it do before. The thing that broke through the managed surface was not grief and was not sentiment, but was something warmer than both the expression of someone who has just been given access to a memory they needed. He told me that too, Ward said. He said any man who could work with horses and chose instead to spend his days with cattle had made a philosophical error he could not respect. Beckett let out a sound that was partway to a laugh and stopped itself. Did he? Marin said. More than once, Ward said. And for the first time in all the weeks she had known him, she heard something in his voice that was not control. Something that was in the plain sense of the word fond. They ate. The stew was good, the bread was better, and the lamp burned steadily in the center of the table. And outside the kitchen window, the mountain dark had come down, complete. The kind of dark that a city never produces, absolute and without apology. Beckett talked about the forge work he was planning for spring, the new gate hardware improvements to the secondary barn's ventilation. His voice had its usual quality, large and present, but there was something under it tonight that she had been noticing more in the past week, a warmth that was not performance, that did not seem to need an audience. He looked at her when he spoke, the way people look at someone they are including, rather than someone they are impressing. She thought of him on the smithy step when he had told her about the woman he lost in the flood of 1885, how he had described it in the plain way of a man who has carried a fact long enough that the acute edge has gone but the permanent weight remains. She had not offered consolation because consolation was not what it required. She had simply been present, and he had said afterward quietly that the woman he lost would have liked her, and she had understood the gift of that. She told him about the foal that had been born in the breach the first week she was there, whom she had been watching carefully, who was going to be something considerable. She described the way the colt moved at 3 weeks, the loose-hipped quality of his walk that would become something extraordinary in another 2 years if he was given the right ground and the right handling. Callum took out his notebook and made a note. Ward asked 2 technical questions, both of which were the questions of someone who knew horses and was interested in knowing more, and they talked for a while about the colt and about what Harlow's Peak could do with a breeding program if the approach was reconsidered from the ground up. It was the conversation she had been having in pieces for a month in the barn and in the tack room and in the brief exchanges that the daily work permitted. Here at the table with the lamp between them, it became something with more dimension, a conversation between people who were planning something together rather than simply discussing it, the conversation of people who expect to be in the same place long enough for the plans to matter. The lamp burned down an inch. Beckett found another candle. She kept the ledger in her coat. Callum said to no one in particular, returning to something he had apparently been thinking about since the morning. For 3 weeks, while Drummond was moving her tools and leaving gates open. He looked at Marin. You didn't say anything. I needed more, she said. You had enough after 10 days. Ooh, I had enough to be believed by someone who was already inclined to believe me, she said. That is not the same as enough. Callum considered this and wrote something in the notebook. Beckett said, what would you have needed? The specific sale record for the secondary barn, tack and equipment. I got it 2 weeks ago from the supply delivery invoice. That was the piece that connected the notebook figures to an actual external transaction rather than just an internal discrepancy. She looked at her bowl. Without that piece, Drummond could have argued the notebook was a different accounting method rather than a fraudulent one. With it, he couldn't. Ward had been listening. He said, where did you learn that? My father, she said. He said the difference between a suspicion and a case is whether someone else can follow the evidence to the same conclusion without being told what to look for. The table was quiet for a moment. Not the heavy quiet of people with nothing to say, but the easy quiet of people who are comfortable with the fact that the saying has paused. Ward looked at her across the lamp. She looked back at him. The things that passed in a look like that were not the things that had words assigned to them, yet they were the things that were still becoming, still finding their shape. She looked away first. She looked at the candle Beckett had lit, the small, steady flame in the draft from the kitchen door. "The colt," she said. "We should name him in the spring." "What would you call him?" Callum said. She thought about it. She thought about a bay coat and 4 white stocking legs and the loose-hipped walk that was going to become extraordinary. And she thought about the morning she had arrived at this place and the weight she had been carrying and where it had come from. "Quinn," she said. The table received this quietly. Callum wrote it in his notebook. Beckett nodded once, the nod of someone approving a decision that seems right. Ward did not look away from her. "Quinn, Plum," he said. He said it like a thing that was settled, like a thing that had always been going to be called them and was only now being confirmed. After supper, she walked through the main house to the tack room. She did not have work there. At that hour, she had done all the evening maintenance already, but she wanted to go there. She took a lamp from the hall hook, and she went into the tack room, and she stood in the familiar smell of it, leather and oil and horse, and she looked at the walls with their ranked equipment. She went to the back wall where the saddle rack ran above the storage chest, the place where the best tack was kept, the equipment that was used for particular purposes and maintained with care. She had her father's saddle under her arm. She had carried it from her room without planning to. She looked at the rack. On the left, a place that had been open for some time, a space between 2 brackets that had something missing from it. On the right, Ward's right saddle, dark brown and heavy, and bearing on its right fender, a scar she had noticed weeks ago. A puckered circular mark in the leather, the size of a rifle ball. A hole that had been repaired with a neat patch of newer leather, but was still visible, still legible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. She stood with her father's saddle in her hands, and she looked at the space on the left. She set it in the brackets. She stepped back and looked at them side by side. Her father's saddle and Ward Harlow's saddle on the same rack, 4 inches of space between them. 2 objects that had been in the same place 11 years ago, on a ridge in Montana territory, on a morning that had ended one life and marked another forever. Here now in a tack room in Colorado, in a ranch built by a man who had spent a decade trying to earn back something he thought he had taken. She put her hand on her father's saddle. She kept it there. "I see you found the rack." Ward was in the doorway. She had not heard him come, but she was not startled. His presence had a quality she had grown accustomed to. It arrived without alarm. "I hope it's all right," she said. He came into the tack room and looked at the 2 saddles and was quiet for a moment. "My saddle's been there since the first year I built this place," he said. "I put the brackets at that spacing because I thought they might be used the way they're being used now." He paused. "I couldn't have told you why. At the time, I told myself it was practical planning." She looked at him. He was looking at the saddles, and the lamplight was on the left side of his face, the familiar division of light and shadow. "You carried it for 11 years, she said. "Yes." "You built this ranch with it." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, he would have approved of the horses. He would have had opinions about the cattle. Ward looked at her, and what was in his face in that moment was the full measure of what he had been carrying. The guilt and the grief and the 11 years of trying to build something that would be worth the cost. And underneath all of that, something that was not guilt and was not grief, something that had been growing in the tack room evenings, in the lamplit silences, in the exchange of papers, under a door in the dark. "He said something else that last night at camp," Ward said. His voice was careful, the way voices are careful around things that matter. He said, "Harlow, the only debt worth carrying is the kind that makes you into someone worth knowing. The rest of it is just weight." She looked at him steadily. "He would have liked you," she said. It came out simply, without ornamentation, which was the only way it could have come out. He had a weakness for difficult men who were trying. Something moved through Ward's face. Then he reached out and touched the bracket that held her father's saddle, his hand resting beside hers on the same worn leather. "Stay," he said, "not because of the contract, not because of what I owe to the name Quinn." A pause. "Because this is where you belong. Because the work you're doing here is work that matters, and there is more of it ahead. Because this place has been waiting for what you brought into it without knowing it was waiting. He looked at her. Stay, he said again, and this time the word carried everything that the first saying of it had not yet said. And she understood it as what it was, not a request and not a negotiation, but an invitation offered by a man who had not known he had it in him to make one. She kept her hand on the saddle. I'm not going anywhere, she said. The lamp between them held its small, steady flame. Winter finished itself in the way winters do, slowly and without apology, taking its time with the last of the ice and the last of the gray mornings. Then March came, and behind it the quality of light that belongs to the high country in early spring, a light that has weight and direction, a light that means business. The Quinn colt was 3 months old by the time the first real warmth arrived, and he was everything Marin had seen in him at 3 weeks and more. He moved through the upper meadow with the loose, extraordinary quality of a horse that has not yet been taught what it cannot do, and she watched him from the fence with Callum beside her and his notebook in his hands. He's going to be the best horse in 3 counties, Callum said without inflection, the way Callum said everything he was certain of. At least, she said. The ranch had changed in the 6 weeks since Drummond left, changed in the way that a place changes when a source of chronic, low-grade harm is removed. The men who remained worked differently, with less of the lateral caution that people develop when the atmosphere they work in has been made unpredictable by a person with bad intentions. The work was the same work. The horses were the same horses. The mountains were identical. But the quality of the air had shifted, and everyone in it had felt the shift, and no one had felt the need to discuss it. 2 new hands had been hired, both recommended by the blacksmith in Coldwater Creek, both younger than anyone who had worked the ranch before, both willing to be taught. Callum was teaching them the notation system. Marin was teaching them the approach she had learned from her father, the relational vocabulary, the understanding of an animal as a partner rather than a tool. They learned with the eagerness of young men who have found something worth being serious about. She had moved into the larger room with the east-facing window when Ward offered it in February, and she had made it hers in the way that rooms become yours incrementally. A jar of dried wildflowers from the lower meadow on the windowsill, a braided rag rug on the floor, a shelf that Callum had built for her books, which she had sent for from storage in Philadelphia, and which had arrived in a crate that smelled of her old apartment and of her father's study where he had kept them before her. The evenings had become a different thing than they had been, not structured, not scheduled, but present. After supper most nights, they ended up in some combination on the porch or in the kitchen or in the main room, the 4 of them occupying the space together in the easy way of people who have established their positions relative to each other and found them good. Beckett played the guitar on warm evenings, the instrument he had carried from the house he'd grown up in, kept in its case on a shelf in his room. He played the old songs, the ones that did not require an audience, the ones you played because the music was company. She had told him once that she liked to hear it, and he had said nothing in return, but after that he played more often, and she understood that as its own kind of language. His left leg was easier these days, she had noticed. Not the leg itself, which would always be what it was, but the way he moved with it, less compensating, more simply moving. She did not say anything about it. She did not need to. Callum she knew best through the notebook, which had grown by late winter into a collaborative document that was no longer quite his or quite hers, but was genuinely both. The system for tracking horse health and temperament they had built together combined the relational vocabulary she had grown up with and Callum's notation efficiency and produced something more useful than either source alone. She had written to a man in Philadelphia who published practical guides for working ranches describing the system, and he had expressed interest in seeing more. She had told Ward about the letter, and he had looked at it and said, "You should pursue that." She said, "It came out of both our work, Callum's and mine." He said, "Then both of you should pursue it." This was Ward. This was who he was, the man underneath the 11 years of managed distance. Direct and unglamorous and fundamentally decent. The kind of decent that does not need to announce itself because it is simply the operating system rather than a feature. They had not spoken again the way they had spoken in the tack room the night she put the saddle in its place. They had not needed to. The declaration had been made and received, and what followed it was the daily accumulation of the thing itself, the language of proximity and small choices, and the quality of attention that two people develop for each other when they have decided to be attentive. He was beside her more often than occasion required. She noticed this. She also noticed that she had adjusted her own habits, slightly unconsciously at first, and then consciously in ways that made intersection more likely, that brought her path through the day into the general neighborhood of his. She was not in a hurry. She had not been a woman in a hurry since the morning she stepped off the train in Coldwater Creek and understood that the mountains were not interested in urgency. The mountains had their own schedule, and everything that happened in their shadow happened in relationship to it. She was learning the mountain schedule. She had time. On the first genuine warm evening in late March, they were on the front porch after supper. All four of them. Beckett had his guitar. Callum had his notebook open, but was not writing, just holding it in the loose way of someone thinking rather than recording. The mountains to the west were doing something extraordinary, with the last of the light turning shades that were not quite orange and not quite gold, a color that had no name in any language she knew, but that she had been watching every evening for weeks and suspected she could spend a lifetime watching and not reduce to a word. Ward was beside her on the porch bench. He had been there long enough that the space between them had closed by degrees without comment, the way space closes when neither person is actively maintaining it. Their shoulders were touching. The porch was wide. It was not an accident. She looked at the mountains. He said, "I used to sit out here alone every night." She waited. "First 3 years," he said, "after I built the house before the brothers came out. Just me and whatever this place was before it became what it is now." He looked at the mountains too. "I thought I was watching the mountains. I think now I was watching for something that I could not have described to you if you'd asked me." She said nothing. "The day you walked into this yard," he said, and his voice was quiet and level. The voice of someone saying a true thing carefully. "I understood something I had been circling for a long time without being able to say it. That what I had been watching for was the thing that comes into a place when the right person enters it. The thing that cannot be built or planned. It either arrives or it does not." He looked at her. "It arrived," he said. She turned to look at him. The mountains were doing their impossible thing with the last light behind him, and the porch lamp was lit. And somewhere Beckett's guitar had settled into one of the slow songs, the ones without a defined shape, the ones that go where they go. She found his hand on the bench between them. He turned his hand over, and she put hers in it, and his hand closed around hers with the simple certainty of something that has been oriented toward this for a long time and has finally arrived. Across the porch, Beckett's guitar found a new phrase, something slower and more deliberate. The music of a man who has set something down that he had been carrying for a long time and found that his hands were freer than he remembered. Callum closed his notebook without writing anything in it, which she had never seen him do before, and looked out at the mountains with the expression of someone who has arrived without planning to at exactly where they needed to be. "My father would have had opinions about your cattle operation," she said. Ward looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in the way it moved when something had bypassed his management and reached him directly. "He mentioned his opinions about cattle more than once," Ward said. "He had strong views on the subject." He was not wrong. She looked at their hands. She looked at the mountains in the fading gold that was becoming something else now. Something quieter, the mountains releasing the day. The way they released everything slowly and without regret, keeping what they kept and letting the rest go. She thought about the train platform in Coldwater Creek, the woman stepping off with a dead man's saddle and the mountains in front of her, and nothing behind her that she could afford to go back to. She thought about the weight of the saddle and the weight of the secrets inside it, and the weight of what she had not known she was carrying toward the place and the people and the ordinary, extraordinary dailiness of a life that fit. She thought about her father, who had talked about her on a mountain ridge the night before he died, to a man who would carry the conversation for 11 years and build a ranch at the end of it, and stand in the yard when she arrived and wait to see what she would do. She thought about the two saddles side by side on the rack in the tack room, the bullet hole in one and the covered mark in the other, both of them worn by the weight of specific lives, both of them resting now in the same dark and the same good air. She held Ward Harlow's hand on the porch of Harlow's Peak in the last light of the first warm evening of spring, and she listened to Beckett's guitar, and she watched Callum look at the mountains with his notebook closed, and the mountains held everything in their enormous, patient dark way they had always held it, indifferent to the small human dramas enacted in their shadow, and for exactly that reason the safest possible witness to them. Thomas Quinn had told her when she was 7 years old and sitting on a fence watching him work a young horse in the round pen, when you find the place where you belong, you will know it not by how it looks, but by what it does not require you to carry alone. She had been 7 years old. She had not known what he meant. She knew now. The lamp on the porch held its flame against the coming dark. The mountains kept their silence. The first stars appeared above the western ridge, small and specific. The same stars that had been there the night her father rode into Raven Canyon, and the same stars that had been there every night since. She was still here. She was going to be still here. That was enough. That was in the particular and irreplaceable way of enough everything.